The hallway was painted a tired shade of pale blue, the kind hospitals use to pretend they are calm places. That color followed me everywhere that winter, even into my dreams. It clung to my clothes, to the skin of my hands, to the air I breathed, like something cold and damp that wouldn't let go. Outside the kitchen window, snow fell in soft, slow flakes, turning the world white and quiet. Inside, my house felt louder than it ever had, even though no one was speaking to me. The radiator ticked like a nervous clock. The kettle on the stove screamed, and then went silent. And somewhere down the hallway, my son's voice drifted through a half-closed door, low and careful, as if he didn't want the walls to hear him. That was the moment everything changed. I was standing there with a mug in my hands, steam rising into my face, when I heard my name spoken in a way that made my stomach tighten. It wasn't the way he said it when he was a boy, all bright and careless. It was clipped, practical, stripped of feeling. The words that followed felt like they were being carved into me with a blade. Nursing home, paperwork, sooner rather than later. The blue hallway seemed to stretch and bend, like I was looking through water. My heart began to beat in my ears, drowning out the rest of the world. For a second, I wondered if I was still alive or if I had already become a ghost in my own house. I didn't mean to listen. I had never been the kind of person who eavesdropped. But when your own child is discussing your life like a broken appliance, you don't walk away. You stand there frozen because part of you hopes you misheard and part of you knows you didn't. My name is Margaret Hale. I am 68 years old, and until that winter morning, I believed that the hardest years of my life were behind me. I had buried my husband, raised my son on my own after cancer took his father too early, and rebuilt a life out of grief and quiet strength. I believed I had done enough to earn a little peace. I believed that love, once given, would always find its way back to me. I was wrong. I moved into my son Daniel's house 2 years earlier, after a fall in my old kitchen left me with a fractured hip and a fear of being alone. The doctor said I would heal, but slowly. My house, the one I had lived in for 35 years, had too many stairs, too many memories, too many empty rooms that echoed with my husband's laughter. Daniel insisted I come stay with him and his wife, Laura. Just until you're back on your feet, he said. He had that same warm smile he had as a child when he wanted something. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to feel needed again. At first, it felt like a gift. Their house was warm, full of light, and the smell of coffee in the mornings. My grandson Oliver would crawl into my bed before school and tell me about his dreams. Laura would leave soup on the stove for me when she worked late. Daniel helped me up the stairs and joked that I was getting an all-inclusive retirement plan. I laughed because that was easier than admitting how afraid I was of growing old alone. But time changes things. It always does. As my hip healed, I tried to make myself useful. I folded laundry, cooked dinner when I could, watched Oliver after school. I stayed out of their way. I learned to move quietly, like a guest who overstayed her welcome. Slowly, the warmth cooled. Conversations grew shorter. Laura's smiles felt strained. Daniel seemed tired in a way I didn't recognize, like something heavy was pressing down on him. I told myself it was stress, work, the economy, the endless worries of adulthood. I told myself it had nothing to do with me. But there were moments that made my chest tighten. The way Laura sighed when I asked where the tea bags were kept. The way Daniel avoided eye contact when I mentioned going back to my house someday. The way they spoke about their future like I wasn't standing in the room. Still, I never imagined this. The words I overheard replayed in my head like a broken record. Nursing home. Sooner rather than later. I pressed my back against the wall, afraid my legs would give out. My hands were shaking so badly, I nearly dropped the mug. I felt foolish, small, disposable. The house I thought was my refuge suddenly felt like a place I was being stored until someone decided what to do with me. I wanted to confront them. I wanted to burst into that room and demand to know how my life had become a problem to be solved. But something held me back. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was fear of confirming what I already knew. So I went to my room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my hands like they belonged to someone else. That night I barely slept. I listened to the house settle, to footsteps in the hallway, to the faint hum of the refrigerator. Every sound felt like a reminder that I did not belong here. In the dark, memories rose like old ghosts. Daniel as a toddler, reaching for me when he was scared. Daniel at 16, crying in the kitchen after his first heartbreak. Daniel standing beside me at his father's funeral, holding my hand so tightly I could feel his pulse. How had we come to this? In the morning, I acted like nothing had happened. I made breakfast, smiled at Oliver, asked Laura about her day. Inside, I was unraveling. I watched them with new eyes, noticing every small gesture, every whisper. They spoke about budgets, about space, about how hard it was to manage everything. They never said my name, but it was always there, hovering in the air like a shadow. Days passed, and the tension grew heavier. I started to feel like a burden, even when no one said it outright. I stopped asking for help. I avoided the living room when they were home. I retreated into myself, shrinking to fit the space they had left for me. One evening, I heard Daniel on the phone in the backyard. His voice was tired, frustrated. "I don't know how much longer we can do this," he said. "It's not fair to Laura, to Oliver. She needs more care than we can give." My heart clenched at the word needs. I had never thought of myself as someone who needed too much. I realized then that this wasn't a passing thought. It was a plan, already forming, already moving forward without me. I felt invisible, erased from my own story. For a long time I sat with that pain, letting it wash over me in waves. I questioned everything. Had I failed as a mother? Had I asked for too much? Had I stayed too long? The shame was as heavy as the sadness. I felt like I was being punished for growing old. But beneath the hurt, something else began to stir. A quiet resolve. I had survived loss before. I had rebuilt my life from ashes. I would not let myself be reduced to a problem in someone else's life. One afternoon, while Daniel and Laura were out, I found a folder on the kitchen counter. It was labeled options. Inside were brochures for assisted living facilities, glossy pictures of smiling seniors in beige rooms. My name was written on a sticky note. I stared at it for a long time, feeling both numb and strangely clear. They had already chosen a path for me. Now I had to choose one for myself. I went back to my room and pulled out an old box of documents I had brought from my house. Deeds, bank statements, letters from my husband. I spread them across the bed, like pieces of a puzzle. I realized I had more control than I thought. My house was still mine. My savings were still mine. My life was still mine, even if it didn't feel that way. That night I wrote a letter. Not to Daniel, but to myself. I wrote about the woman I had been, the strength I had found in the darkest moments, the love I had given freely. I wrote about the life I still wanted to live, the places I wanted to see, the peace I deserved. When I finished, my hand was cramped, but my heart felt lighter. The next morning, I told Daniel I wanted to visit my old house. He looked surprised, then relieved. He offered to drive me, but I insisted on going alone. I needed to face it by myself. When I unlocked the door, the familiar smell of dust and wood greeted me like an old friend. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the empty rooms. It was quiet, but not lonely. It felt like home. I walked through each room, touching the walls, remembering the life I had built there. I realized I didn't want to return to the past, but I didn't want to be erased from the present either. I wanted a future where I was valued, not managed. Over the next few weeks, I made quiet arrangements. I met with a lawyer, a financial advisor. I explored communities that felt alive, not like waiting rooms for the end. Places where people laughed, learned, lived. I found a small apartment in a senior community near the park where I used to take Daniel as a child. It had large windows and a garden out back. It felt like a beginning. I didn't tell Daniel right away. I needed time to gather my courage, to decide how much of my heart I was willing to lay bare. When I finally sat him down, my hands were shaking, but my voice was steady. I told him what I had overheard. I told him how it made me feel. I told him about my plans. He looked stunned, then ashamed. Tears filled his eyes as he apologized, saying he thought he was doing what was best, that he didn't know how to talk to me about it. We sat in silence, the weight of everything unsaid between us. I realized then that love can exist alongside fear, and that fear can make people do terrible things. I moved out a month later. Oliver hugged me tightly, promising to visit. Laura thanked me, her voice thick with emotion. Daniel helped carry my boxes, his eyes red. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was honest. In my new home, I found a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. I made friends. I took art classes. I walked in the park and watched the seasons change. I learned that growing old doesn't mean growing invisible. It means choosing again and again to claim your place in the world. Sometimes I still think about that blue hallway and the words that shattered me. But I also think about the woman who stood up in the quiet and chose herself. I am still here. I am still living. And that, to me, is the greatest victory of all.